Sophie Carter stirred her coffee slowly, watching the milk spiral into a soft beige cloud. The kitchen was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each second echoing louder than the last. Her husband, Daniel, sat at the table, scrolling through emails on his phone, his expression unreadable, distant. She glanced at him, then looked away just as quickly. "You're working on a Sunday?" she asked, her voice soft but deliberate. Daniel didn't look up. Deadlines moved. "I need to get ahead on the Ridgemont project." Sophie nodded, hiding the flicker of disappointment behind her coffee mug. This had become routine. Empty conversations over breakfast, nights spent in silence, and a growing gap neither of them acknowledged. A gap so wide, it had begun to feel like another presence in the house. She remembered when mornings were filled with playful arguments and unfiltered laughter. Now they only exchanged logistics. Who's picking up the dry cleaning? Who's paying the gardener? Who forgot to lock the back door? Love, once abundant, had thinned into politeness. "You could take a break, just for a bit," she tried again, hoping to catch something, anything in his eyes. Daniel sighed, finally setting his phone down. "Sophie, not everything can pause just because it's the weekend." There it was again, the deflection, the subtle irritation, the undertone that told her she was asking for too much. She looked down at the table.
"Right.
Of course." After a few moments, he stood and walked out without another word. She heard his car start, the engine rev, then silence again. The silence that always seemed louder after he left. Later that afternoon, Sophie found herself at a cafe across town, her journal open but untouched. She stared out the window, watching couples laugh and sip their lattes, the kind of ordinary intimacy she hadn't felt in months. "Writing or just pretending to?" a familiar voice asked. She turned and smiled faintly. Jason Miller, her coworker from the marketing agency. Tall, approachable, always carrying that quiet warmth. He slid into the seat across from her without asking, his easy confidence disarming. "Bit of both," she replied, closing the journal halfway. "Mostly just staring at nothing." Jason nodded, not pressing her. "It's okay to not have the words sometimes. Silence has its own weight." Sophie let out a dry laugh. "Seems like I'm carrying a lot of it lately." They spoke for an hour, nothing profound, just simple, unfiltered conversation. It felt good to be seen, even in a fleeting way. Jason didn't ask probing questions or offer hollow advice. He just listened, something Daniel had stopped doing long ago. As they parted ways, Jason touched her arm gently. "You don't always have to pretend you're okay, Sophie. Not with me." The words lingered longer than they should have. That night, Daniel came home late. Sophie didn't ask where he'd been. She had stopped counting the hours he disappeared. But something caught her eye, a faint trace of perfume that wasn't hers clung to his collar, subtle but unmistakable. She hesitated. "Did you meet with clients today?" He paused briefly.
"Yeah."
Lunch meeting ran long. She nodded slowly, filing the moment away. Another piece of a puzzle she didn't want to solve yet. The next day, Lena Brooks stopped by. Sophie's oldest friend, bubbly and radiant, always appearing with a bottle of wine and unsolicited advice. "You look tired," Lena said, pouring a glass without waiting. "Everything okay?" Sophie hesitated. "Just work. And a life, I guess." Lena leaned in. "You sure it's just that?" Sophie studied her friend's face, noticing something flicker in her eyes. A hint of tension, too subtle for most to catch. "I'm fine," Sophie replied, forcing a smile. As the evening drew on, Sophie's thoughts kept circling the same quiet realization. She was lonely, not just in the absence of touch, but in the absence of presence. The kind of loneliness that grows louder in a room full of people. And somewhere in that void, she began to wonder, if emotional hunger leads you to someone else, is that betrayal or survival? She didn't know the answer. Not yet. But she knew something was shifting. And deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop it. The air in Sophie's bedroom was thick with stillness. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the floor. Daniel was already asleep, his back turned, breath steady, unfazed. Sophie stared at the ceiling, her body present but her mind wandering places she couldn't admit out loud. She hadn't meant to replay Jason's words, but they clung to her. You don't always have to pretend you're okay. No one had spoken to her like that in years, not even Daniel. Especially not Daniel. The next morning, she lingered at the mirror longer than usual. Her fingers traced the outline of her cheekbones, eyes searching for something familiar. Beauty, worth, perhaps just proof that she hadn't faded entirely. She brushed her hair twice more than needed and reached for a different shade of lipstick. Nothing bold, just something not routine. At work, Jason noticed. New look, he asked casually. Sophie smiled. Just felt like a change. You wear it well, he said, then looked away, almost too quickly. That same afternoon, Daniel called to say he wouldn't be home for dinner. Again. Client dinner, he said. Might run late. Sophie replied with a muted, okay, but her chest tightened. He didn't ask about her day. He didn't even pretend to care. She spent the evening alone, restless. As she tidied the living room, her eyes landed on Daniel's blazer draped over a chair. Something compelled her to check the pockets, a motion she hated herself for, but couldn't resist. Her fingers found a crumpled receipt from a fine dining restaurant across town. The date was 2 nights ago. 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, dessert for 2. She hadn't been there. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. Her heart wasn't racing, just beating slowly, heavily, as if bracing for something her mind refused to process. Later that week, Lena dropped by unannounced. She greeted Sophie with her usual brightness, but there was a peculiar stiffness in her movements, a subtle discomfort that hadn't been there before. Daniel's working late again? She asked, casually pouring wine without waiting for an answer. Sophie nodded, watching her friend closely. Seems like every night. Lena bit her lip, hesitating. You've talked to him about it? Not really. What would I even say? Sophie's voice was sharper than intended. Lena looked down at her glass. You're not the kind of woman who just waits around, Sophie. The comment sat oddly in the air. Sophie studied her for a long moment. There was a flicker in Lena's eyes again, guilt, maybe. Or fear. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, Sophie said quietly. Lena laughed nervously. Nothing. Just saying, you deserve more than silence. Sophie didn't respond, but something shifted inside her. That weekend, Jason invited her to an art exhibit downtown. It's just a thing my friend is curating. Thought you might enjoy it. No pressure. She said yes. They walked through rows of abstract pieces and portrait photography, discussing color theory and life in a way that felt strangely intimate. Jason didn't reach for her hand, didn't make a move, but the space between them buzzed with unspoken possibilities. At one point, Sophie stood in front of a painting, a chaotic swirl of color, jagged and raw. It looks like something torn apart and stitched back together, she said softly. Jason stepped beside her. Maybe it is. Maybe that's what healing looks like. She turned toward him then, her eyes searching his face, not for affection, but for clarity. His gaze didn't waver. Jason, she began, unsure what she was even trying to say. He shook his head gently. You don't have to explain. I'm just here. Later that night, Sophie sat in bed, staring at her phone. A message notification blinked on screen, unknown number. Please put your trust where it truly belongs. Not everyone around you is who they claim to be. She read it twice, then a third time. Her skin prickled. The words weren't threatening, but they held weight. Ominous. Intentional. A warning disguised as advice. She looked toward Daniel's side of the bed. Empty again. And in that moment, she realized the cracks weren't just growing. They were beginning to split open. Something was coming. And for the first time, Sophie wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. The message still lingered in Sophie's mind days later, looping in her thoughts like a whisper she couldn't quiet. Please put your trust where it truly belongs. Not everyone around you is who they claim to be. It hadn't come again. No follow-up. No explanation. but its echoes seemed to reverberate through every room she walked into, every conversation she had. And when she looked at Daniel now, she no longer saw her husband. She saw a man carefully concealing something behind a rehearsed normalcy. She decided she was done waiting for clarity to come to her. It was time to seek it herself. That Friday, she left work early. Daniel had told her he was attending another client dinner, his tone flat, too practiced. She didn't confront him. She simply smiled, kissed his cheek, and said, "Good luck with your presentation." Then she followed him. She kept her distance, driving a few cars behind, heart pounding steadily but not erratically. She wasn't anxious. She was determined. Daniel parked outside a boutique hotel on the edge of the city. Not a restaurant. Not an office. A hotel. Sophie waited in her car, watching as he stepped out and made a call. Moments later, Lena arrived. There was no confusion. No room for doubt. Lena didn't even hesitate. She walked straight into Daniel's arms, laughing as he whispered something against her ear. They didn't see her. They didn't even look around. The betrayal was bold, familiar, rehearsed. Sophie couldn't breathe for a second, not because of the sight, but because of the silence that followed. Her heart didn't break. It hardened. She drove away without a sound. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just shut down. Later that night, she waited for Daniel to return. He came in quietly, tossing his keys into the bowl by the door. When he turned, he froze. Sophie was already standing there, coat still on, a stillness in her eyes that unsettled him. "Where were you?" she asked plainly. He hesitated. "I told you, dinner with a client." She tilted her head. "Which client?" There was a pause. Too long. Too careful. Mark Pearson," he replied. "He's from—" "I followed you," she cut in, her voice calm, surgical. Daniel paled. Sophie stepped forward, placing her phone on the table. "I saw you. I saw her. You didn't even try to hide it." His lips parted, then closed again. Whatever excuse he was reaching for died before it reached his tongue. "How long?" she asked. Daniel swallowed hard. It wasn't supposed to happen. "That's not an answer." 3 months, he said finally, shame painted across his features. "It started after one of our fights. I didn't plan it." Sophie laughed bitterly. "You don't just fall into bed with someone. And, of all people, Lena?" "It was a mistake," he said quickly. "It's over." "No, Daniel. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." Repeated. Calculated. Hidden. He looked away, guilt thick in his silence. Sophie sat down slowly, her body suddenly heavy. "I want to know, was there ever a point you felt sorry? Not for getting caught, for betraying me." He opened his mouth again but said nothing. She stood, grabbing her coat. "You know what's funny? I kept thinking I was the problem, that I was hard to reach, hard to love." Daniel moved toward her. "Sophie, please." "Don't," she said sharply. "You lost the right to reach for me the moment you chose her." Before she left, she turned back briefly. "And if you're wondering, no, I didn't sleep with Jason. But I did feel more seen by him in 10 minutes than I have in 10 years with you." The door clicked shut behind her. She didn't go to Jason's place. She didn't want rescue or comfort. She wanted space to breathe, to feel the full weight of what had shattered, and what still remained. Sophie checked into a small inn on the outskirts of town. No one knew where she was. Not even Jason. She needed to be invisible, just for a while. Not a wife. Not a friend. Not a broken woman. Just Sophie. And in the stillness of that room, staring out into the night sky, she realized something profound. Her pain was real, but so was her power. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for someone else to save her. It was quiet, eerily so, but Sophie welcomed the silence. It was a different kind of quiet than the one in her home. This silence wasn't hollow or heavy. It didn't echo the absence of love. It simply was uncomplicated, undemanding. She sat by the window most mornings, fingers curled around a cup of tea, watching the world unfold without her. No meetings, no obligations, no carefully crafted smiles. Just solitude. For the first time in years, Sophie didn't feel like she was performing. The messages from Daniel came quickly, first confused, then desperate. Please talk to me. We can fix this. You're the only one who matters. She read them all but never replied. Words were meaningless now, paper-thin promises from a man who had torn their foundation to shreds. Love, when fractured by betrayal, didn't break clean. It splintered, and every fragment carried a weight she wasn't willing to hold anymore. A few days later, a knock came at her door. Jason. He looked unsure, hesitant in a way she'd never seen before. He held a small bouquet, nothing extravagant, just daisies and lavender, soft and sincere. I didn't come to interfere, he said quietly. I just wanted to know you're okay. Sophie stepped aside, letting him in. They didn't speak right away. He sat across from her, watching her with a kind of reverence she wasn't used to. Not possession. Not pity. Just presence. I saw Daniel, he finally said. At the agency. He looked lost. Sophie offered a faint nod. He should be. Jason hesitated, then added, Lena's gone. Quit her job. No one's seen her since you confronted them. Sophie looked out the window. I'm not surprised. Cowards always run when truth finds them. Jason leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I don't want to step on whatever you're processing, Sophie. But I need you to hear this. You didn't deserve any of it. Not the silence, not the betrayal, not the self-doubt they wrapped around you like a noose. His words struck her gently, but deeply. She blinked, holding back the emotion rising in her throat. I believed him for so long, she said softly. Even when he gave me nothing, I kept giving everything. I thought loyalty meant staying. But now I see, it's not loyalty if it costs you yourself. Jason nodded, saying nothing more. He understood. That was all she needed. That evening, Sophie wrote a letter. Not for Daniel, but for herself. You were never hard to love. You were just loving someone who didn't know how to hold what was precious. His betrayal doesn't define your worth. It reflects his emptiness, not your inadequacy. She folded the note and placed it in her journal. A quiet declaration of closure. The next morning, she returned home, not to reclaim her past, but to collect what still belonged to her. The house felt foreign now. Cold, unfamiliar, like walking through a memory that no longer fit. Daniel was there, waiting. His eyes lit up when she entered, but Sophie remained still. I didn't think you'd come back, he said, voice low. I'm not staying, she replied simply. A flicker of panic crossed his face. Sophie, please. I made a mistake. I lost my way, but I can fix this. No, she said firmly. You can't fix what you chose to destroy. I gave you chances long before this. You didn't lose your way. You walked away from me willingly. Daniel reached for her hand, but she stepped back. You don't get to touch me like that anymore. He looked shattered. But Sophie didn't feel pity. Only clarity. I came for my things, she said. Not to hear your regret. She packed quietly. Books, journals, a few keepsakes. Not the wedding photos. Not the anniversary gifts. Not the dreams they once painted together. Those belonged to another life, one she no longer claimed. As she walked out for the last time, Daniel stood in the doorway, speechless. She didn't look back. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, freer. Later that night, she stood on her balcony at the inn, watching dusk melt into darkness. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jason. No rush. No pressure. Just, when you're ready, I'd like to take you somewhere the silence feels peaceful, not lonely. She smiled softly. She didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, the story ahead was entirely hers to write.